May 1957. Chicago. Leonard Chess held a test pressing in his hands. 12 tracks, 2 sides, 1 artist. This was only the second LP his label had ever released. The first had been a compilation, a safe bet, spread across multiple artists. But this was Chuck Berry, all Chuck Berry. And Leonard Chess wasn't sure anyone would buy it. The singles had worked. Maybelline crossed over in 1955. Roll Over Beethoven climbed the charts in 1956. But an album was different. Albums were statements. Albums required commitment. And in 1957 America, asking white teenagers to buy a full LP from a black artist wasn't just a business risk, it was a cultural gamble. Berry had recorded these tracks across 6 separate sessions, spanning nearly 2 years. They weren't conceived as an album. They were singles, B-sides, studio experiments, fragments of an artist trying to figure out who he was and who would listen. But now they sat together on one piece of vinyl. And the question hanging in the air at Chess Records was simple. Would America accept this? To understand what Chess Records was attempting, you have to understand what was broken. In 1955, music in America existed behind invisible walls. Race music for black audiences, hillbilly for white. The charts were segregated. The radio stations were segregated. Even the record bins in stores kept the genres apart. Chuck Berry saw something different at the Cosmopolitan Club in St. Louis. He'd been playing piano player Johnny Johnson's gigs since 1952. The Cosmo had a black audience, but Berry noticed something odd when he threw country songs into the set. People laughed at first, then they requested them, then they danced. And eventually, white teenagers started showing up. Berry later recalled watching the crowd. Nearly half became white. In segregated Missouri, at a black club, because of the music. That's what Leonard Chess heard when Berry auditioned. Not just talent, not just songs, but the sound of a barrier cracking. Maybelline, Berry's reworked version of a country tune called Ida Red, sold over 1 million copies. It hit number 1 on the R&B chart and number 5 on the pop chart. But more importantly, it proved something. The teenagers didn't care about the categories. They just wanted the music. By 1957, Berry had released 5 hit singles. But singles were disposable. An album meant something else. It meant Berry wasn't a novelty. It meant Chess believed he could sustain attention across 12 tracks. It meant betting that white teenagers would walk into a record store and deliberately choose a Chuck Berry LP. And in the spring of 1957, no one knew if that bet would pay off. The sessions that would become After School Session revealed something unsettling. Berry wasn't just making rock and roll. He was making compromises. Johnny Johnson later felt that distinction deeply. Johnson's piano work had been the foundation of Berry's early sound, the propulsive boogie-woogie that made Maybelline and Wee Wee Hours unstoppable. But as Berry's star rose, something shifted. The credits read, Chuck Berry. Just Chuck Berry. Johnson didn't push back at first. He figured steady work with Berry beat anything else. The gigs paid. The sessions happened. But the absence of his name on those songs, songs he'd helped shape, songs built on his piano lines, began to feel like erasure. And there was another problem. Berry was 30 years old in 1955 when Maybelline broke. His audience? Teenagers. 15, 16, 17 years old. White kids discovering that the music their parents feared might actually speak to them. Berry understood what they wanted before they did. He wrote about cars, girls, school, frustration, the texture of teenage life rendered in vivid detail. But this understanding came with a cost. He had to write around the reality of who he was. When Berry first drafted what would become Johnny B. Good in 1958, he later revealed that the original lyric described that little colored boy, but he knew no radio station would play it. so he changed it to Country Boy. The meaning survived, coded and careful. By the time After School Session was being compiled in early 1957, Berry had learned how to navigate this impossible balance. Be black enough to be authentic, but not so black that white audiences would turn away. It was a tightrope, and he walked it alone. The album had no creative unity because it was never meant to be an album. Wee Wee Hours had been recorded in May 1955, a blues piece Johnson had been playing for years before Berry added lyrics. School Day was cut in January 1957, almost 2 years later. Between those sessions, Berry had evolved. The sound had evolved. His understanding of the audience had evolved. And Chess Records had evolved too. Leonard and Phil Chess ran a blues label. Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Little Walter, that was their world. Berry's crossover success confused them as much as it thrilled them. They saw the money, but they didn't fully understand what Berry was building. Some critics later felt that tension. Fred Rothwell, a Berry biographer, noted that School Day, the album's opening track and biggest hit, felt deliberately tailored for the white teenage market, in ways that didn't quite ring true. But what did ring true even mean? Berry's music was a collision by design. Blues and country, R&B and hillbilly, black roots and white appeal. Every song was a negotiation. Every lyric balanced between authenticity and accessibility. The album assembled 12 of these negotiations and asked the listener to treat them as a coherent statement. It wasn't entirely coherent. 3 tracks were pure rockers: School Day, Too Much Monkey Business, and Brown-Eyed Handsome Man. But the rest? Blues instrumentals, ballads, a rumba-inflected closer called Drifting Heart. For buyers expecting wall-to-wall rock and roll, After School Session was going to be a surprise, and in 1957, surprises could kill an album. March 1957. School Day hit the radio. It wasn't just a single, it was a manifesto. The song opened with Berry's guitar mimicking a school bell, a technique borrowed directly from Johnny Johnson's piano style. Then came the verses. Crowded hallways, boring classes, a lunchroom where you're lucky to find a seat. The details were so specific, so visceral, that teenagers recognized their own lives in Berry's lyrics. But the final verse was something else. Berry sang about dropping a coin in a jukebox, hearing rock and roll blast through the speakers, and feeling delivered from the days of old. That line, "Hail, hail, rock and roll," became the song's emotional climax. It was liberation. It was identity. It was a generation claiming its sound. School Day peaked at number 3 on the pop chart in April 1957. It hit number 1 on the R&B chart. And suddenly, Chess Records had a problem they hadn't anticipated. Chuck Berry was too big for singles alone. The teenagers wanted more. 2 months later, After School Session arrived. The cover showed Berry in a suit, guitar in hand, with the words "Rockabilly Troubadour" printed on the sleeve. The label was trying to position him, make him legible, marketable, safe. But the music inside refused to be categorized. And now, Berry's career depended on whether white America would accept a full album from him. Not just 3 minutes on the radio. Not just a song they could dance to at a party. But an entire LP. Chuck Berry's name, Chuck Berry's face, Chuck Berry's vision, sitting on their shelf next to Elvis and Buddy Holly. After School Session, there was no going back. The album was the bet. And the results would determine everything. After School Session didn't explode. It arrived quietly. LPs were still a developing format in 1957. Most teenagers bought singles. Albums were for jazz fans, for adults, for collectors with money to spend. Rock and roll lived on 45s you could play at parties and jukeboxes you could feed with quarters. But Chess was shifting strategy. They'd seen the LP market growing, and they believed Berry could be more than a singles artist. The initial reception was mixed in unexpected ways. Fans who bought the album hoping for 12 tracks like School Day were confused by the presence of Wee Wee Hours and Barry Pickin', instrumental blues numbers that showcased Johnson's piano but lacked the teenage urgency that had made Barry famous. Maybelline and Roll Over Beethoven, two of Barry's biggest hits, weren't even on the album. Chess had already packaged those onto Rock, 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 a various artists compilation released months earlier. So listeners looking for Barry's most recognizable songs came up empty. What they got instead was something stranger, a portrait of an artist trying to honor his blues roots while building something entirely new. Some loved it for that reason. Others felt cheated. And the album's commercial performance reflected that division. It sold, but not like the singles. It charted, but didn't dominate. What mattered more was what happened beneath the surface. White teenagers who bought after school session and listened past School Day encountered something they weren't supposed to hear. The blues. Not the sanitized, whitewashed version that would later dominate rock, but the real thing. Johnny Johnson's piano rolling through Wee Wee Hours like a late-night confession. Barry's guitar bending notes in ways that spoke to older, deeper traditions. And by placing those sounds next to School Day and Brown-Eyed Handsome Man, Barry was making an argument. Rock and roll wasn't a break from the blues. It was the blues, transformed. Not everyone got the message, but the ones who did would change music forever. By the end of 1957, Barry's trajectory had shifted irreversibly. Rock and roll music, released in September, climbed to number 8 on the pop chart. He joined Alan Freed's Biggest Show of Stars for 1957 tour, a mixed-race lineup featuring the Everly Brothers, Buddy Holly, and Fats Domino. The shows crisscrossed the country, playing to integrated audiences in places where segregation was still the law. Barry's stage presence became legendary. The duck walk, the guitar solos, the showmanship that made him impossible to ignore. He wasn't just performing songs, he was embodying the rebellion the music promised. But success brought scrutiny. Barry was a black man in his 30s playing to white teenage girls. The optics terrified authorities. And the same crossover appeal that made him a star also made him a target. Meanwhile, Johnny Johnson watched from the piano. Johnson had been there from the beginning. The Cosmopolitan Club, the early chess sessions, the hits that built Barry's empire. But his name appeared on nothing. In 2000, Johnson would sue Barry, claiming co-authorship on over 50 songs. The case was dismissed. Too much time had passed, but Johnson's claim lingered. Barry's autobiography barely mentioned Johnson's contributions. When pressed, Barry characterized their collaboration in ways that minimized Johnson's role. The tension wasn't just about credit, it was about erasure. Whose story got told, whose contributions disappeared into someone else's legend. And there was another cost. After School Session had proven that white teenagers would buy a Chuck Berry album, but that success also locked Barry into a particular image. He was the teenager whisperer, the voice of youth rebellion. And that image required him to keep writing songs about high school, cars, and young love. Even as he aged, even as his life grew more complicated, even as the distance between his persona and his reality widened. The album had opened doors, but it had also built walls Barry would spend decades trying to escape. For years, After School Session existed in the shadow of Barry's later work. Johnny B. Goode became the anthem. Sweet Little 16 defined his commercial peak. The album felt like a transitional artifact, important but incomplete. But as rock and roll history solidified in the 1970s and 1980s, critics began looking back with different eyes. They noticed the sequencing, how School Day opened the album with explosive energy, while Drifting Heart closed it with something melancholy and unresolved. They heard Johnny Johnson's piano throughout, recognizing that Berry's guitar style had been shaped by Johnson's Boogie Woogie Foundation, and they understood the gamble Chess Records had taken. In 1957, the idea that a black artist could sustain a full LP aimed at white teenagers was radical. Most labels wouldn't attempt it, most radio stations wouldn't support it, most record stores wouldn't stock it prominently. But After School Session existed. And its existence changed the calculation for every artist who came after. When the Beatles and the Rolling Stones arrived in the 1960s, they cited Berry as a primary influence, not just his singles, his albums, the way he structured a record, the way he mixed styles, the way he refused to be just one thing. The Stones covered multiple tracks from After School Session. The Beatles built entire songs around Berry's guitar techniques, and both bands understood something the 1957 critics had missed. Berry wasn't compromising by mixing blues and rock. He was showing that they were the same language, spoken with different accents. By the time Berry was inducted as the first member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986, After School Session had been reissued multiple times. Each reissue added context, liner notes explaining the sessions, bonus tracks expanding the portrait, remastering that revealed details buried in the original pressings. The album had become canonical, not perfect, not flawless, but essential. The influence of After School Session extends beyond the songs themselves. It established a template, the debut rock and roll LP, as a statement of identity, mixing past and future, appealing to a young audience while refusing to pander. Elvis had released Elvis Presley in 1956, but that was a collection of covers and Sun Records tracks packaged for RCA. Berry's album felt different, more authored, more intentional, even if it had been assembled from scattered sessions. And the album's crossover success created a roadmap. If Chuck Berry could sell LPs to white teenagers, then other black artists could too. Little Richard, Fats Domino, Bo Diddley, they all followed. The album format became a space where black musicians could assert creative control, where they could demand to be heard beyond the 3-minute single. But the album also exposed the limits of that crossover. Berry's success required compromise, coded lyrics, strategic ambiguity, a persona that white audiences found non-threatening. Other black artists faced the same calculations, and not all of them were willing or able to make those adjustments. The British invasion amplified Berry's influence in unexpected ways. Bands like the Stones and the Beatles didn't just cover his songs. They introduced them to audiences who'd never heard the originals. White British kids singing Chuck Berry to white American kids created a strange loop. Berry's music returned home, laundered through white interpreters, suddenly acceptable in places that had resisted it the first time. That irony stung, but it also demonstrated the power of what Berry had built. His songs were so durable, so structurally perfect, that they survived reinterpretation. They sounded like Berry even when someone else sang them. After School Session sits at the center of that legacy. It's the album where Berry stopped being a singles artist and became a body of work. And in rock and roll, that distinction matters. After School Session arrived at a moment when American culture was fracturing. Teenagers wanted sounds their parents didn't understand. Black artists wanted audiences their society had denied them. Record labels wanted profits without taking risks. Berry gave them all something, but not everything. The album taught a generation of musicians that you could blend genres without losing your identity. That you could write for teenagers without condescending to them. That 3 minutes and 12 bars could contain more truth than an hour of anything else. But it also taught harder lessons. Success required erasure. Johnny Johnson's contributions vanished into Berry's mythology. Berry's blackness had to be softened, coded, made palatable. The same industry that celebrated his music would later imprison him on charges many viewed as racially motivated. After School Session is the sound of someone navigating those contradictions in real time. The album's title itself tells the story. After school session. The moment between obligation and freedom, between what you're supposed to be and who you actually are. That's where Barry lived. That's where rock and roll was born. In 1957, Leonard Chess took a chance on 12 tracks that didn't quite fit together. He pressed them onto vinyl and hoped white teenagers would care. They did, and the music industry never looked the same. 70 years later, After School Session still plays like a gamble. The sequencing feels odd, the tonal shifts jar. Some tracks soar, others meander. But that's the point. The album wasn't trying to be perfect, it was trying to be possible. And in 1957, that was more than enough.